Why are MPAs important? Well, I make my living from filming wildlife, doing a lot of underwater stuff in the cold and in various places. And to be quite honest, if it wasn't for protected areas around the world, places that people were emotionally involved with and were caring about protecting, then there'd be practically F all left to film in the world. So I'm very grateful for anyone who does anything to promote and push MPAs. And I just thought I would take you round a few of the ones that I've been lucky enough to be in. So I work sometimes in the cold and sometimes in nicer, warmer places like the Red Sea, but also Indonesia, other places. I kind of got into photography fairly early. This is the earliest known photograph I have of me. My father used to be a photojournalist, and he had all the equipment, and I remember just going with him to exciting places. And I remember one of the most important people I remember was father used to be a freelance in the days when Dunfermline Athletic had a football team. Those of you who are quite old will remember those days, the 60s, when Jock Stein was the manager. Jock Stein, best Scottish manager ever had. Well, he started off with Dunfermline Athletic, and Jock used to come round the house sometimes after a Saturday night or through the week, because him and the old man got to know each other really well, because Dad did all the goalmouth photography. Anyway, so what I remember was interesting people coming talking to me. But the first thing that I got into, and the thing that's really, still one of my major enjoyments, comes out of diving. I got into diving when I was at school. Then I got into marine biology. Went to Stirling, as Mike will know, and did a degree in marine biology. I actually graduated maybe slightly ahead of Mike, actually, by a wee bit. Anyway, and I went and I did a degree in marine biology, but I wanted to not so much stay in academia, but go into expedition type stuff. So one of the first places I went was to the Red Sea. And I worked with a bunch of biologists from Cambridge University we built this platform because we wanted to study crown of thorns starfish. Now, crown of thorns starfish at that point was a big concern out, especially in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, because it was munching its way through a lot of the reef. But out in the Red Sea, we discovered this reef where the crown of thorns was kind of in balance. So we wanted to study this crown of thorns day and night for at least a couple of weeks. So we built this platform that we could live on out on the reef. And it was really kind of back to basics in a way. This is me, believe it or not. And fresh water was quite rationed out on the reef, So every 2 or 3 days you could put about 10 centimetres of water in the bottom of the baby's bucket, and then you drew straws to who got to wash their nether regions in it first, and then, because you had to use the same water for all 6 people who were out there, so it was progressively getting saltier. Anyway, so this was one day I was on. I'll tell you a story. I showed this to WI Institute. WI, great, lovely people, etc. But there's nothing wrong. It may be old, but there's nothing wrong with their eyesight. Because this woman came up to me at the end and she said, "I couldn't help noticing that you're not a natural blonde." And I thought, what are you looking at? So I showed them this one as well, just taking this one. Anyway, the Red Sea back in those days was just amazing. There was virtually no tourism out in the Red Sea, enormous areas of reefs that we were the first people to dive on it. And it was kind of where I got into underwater photography and learned a few basics, like shooting up the way, get the surface of the water in your background, because it's a bit more interesting. It was also my first experience with big mammals, or not big mammals, big fish. And because I hadn't realised that if you are lucky enough to dive in the same place for a week, then not only do you recognise the individual manta rays, but the manta rays actually recognise you. So that a manta ray that you meet for the first time on a Monday is a much more workable manta ray by the Friday, because you've got to know it and it's got to know you. So it was the beginnings of a kind of feeling a big attachment towards the marine world, and this is what we were working on, crown of thorns. And crown of thorns back in those days, as I say, was a big problem on the Great Barrier Reef, big plague proportions of it. And we found an area in the Red Sea where it was existing in a balance with nature, and we were able to throw some light on the kind of normal predators that would keep the crown of thorns under control, that sort of thing. And then I got this big break. I went to the Antarctic. I went and worked for the British Antarctic Survey in '76 and worked on Signy Island for a few winters. Now, the Antarctic is probably one of the biggest MPAs in the world. There are specific MPAs, you know, within Antarctica. The biggest one, you know, has just been made down here around in the Ross Sea. But really, a lot of the Antarctic is very virgin. There's not very much fishing goes on. There's hardly any human activity in the Antarctic. And I worked on this base called Signy, where we had normal sort of diving in the summer, but then in the winter it would freeze over and we'd dive underneath the ice. And we had several marine biology programs working down there. Now my job was to support those programs, look after the equipment and make sure the guys got their work done. But it was also where I got into photography. And again, I was able to there's a sort of natural MPA down there. If you go out onto the flat seabed, in the shallow seabed in the Antarctic, quite a lot of it is scoured bare by icebergs. Icebergs will trundle across periodically and they just take everything off the underfloor. But if you can get in underneath the overhangs where there's no scour, where there's no you know, physical damage because the ice can't get in under there, that's where all the invertebrates and stuff really get a chance to grow. And you know, I have seen areas at the bottom that have been really damaged by certain fishing techniques, whether, you know, dynamite fishing is the worst, but bottom trawling, stuff like that can be a real issue in places. And this was a classic case where you had the icebergs doing the actual, you know, naturally occurring scouring of the bottom. But it was amazing how much difference there was once you got underneath. You could see all these, you could see the soft corals and all the rest of it. You could sometimes see the fish that were down there. This is an ice fish, you know, all the fish in the Antarctic, when you think about it, they all have to have antifreeze in their blood, because the seawater in the winter goes down to -2 degrees centigrade, and then in the summer gets as high as 0. But basically all the fish down there, if you took a fish from normal UK waters, put it in there, then its blood will freeze. It will get freeze ice crystals in its blood. But this one has antifreeze in its blood, so it can happily carry on down there. We also got to dive with the seals, you know, and you notice a big difference between the Antarctic and the Arctic. You know, all the seals in the Arctic are fairly wary underwater because of the presence of polar bears, but no polar bears in the Antarctic, as I'm sure you all know. No polar bears in the Antarctic, so the seals are much more workable. And I met that man in the Antarctic when I was working as a diver. David came onto our base for a couple of days with a film crew. He came off HMS Endurance. This is in 1981. He came onto base and I basically helped the film crew for a couple of days, and I thought by the end of the couple of days, I thought, you know, pointing at the cameraman, you are doing what I want to do. You're diving, you're traveling, you're working with people like David, you're just having a great time. And they were very generous with their words of advice. And, you know, the rest is history, so to speak. So I've been lucky. I've worked, you know, in the sub-Antarctic a lot with things like black-browed albatross, which is a key component of the environmental marine ecosystem down there. I've also worked with animals in the north that are incredibly clever, and you don't really know where they're going to turn up. They might be there was one in front of me, you know, in all honesty, but there was also this one behind me that stayed away. And I've worked not just on, I don't know, Operation Iceberg, I think, was screened fairly recently. That was a 2-part series. BBC Two did it 3 or 4 years ago now, but that's me behind the camera filming Chris Packham, who's very excited because he's just seen his first polar bear in the water. So it was a nice mix of you know, different things. Now, let me just put this, is this mic switch on? Because we're going to use this mic. Hello? Hello. Let's see, the idea was to put that down there and maybe pick up the sounds. Let's just see, are these things switched on? Yes, okay. Because sometimes I do things that are a wee bit more unusual. Let's see.
That one's on Zoopla. That one is on Zoopla.
That one's on Zoopla.
That's a piece of wood, Jim.
I haven't got my glasses. Start your property search on Zoopla.
So I do those things as well with almost real marine animals. They were real hermit crabs. Obviously not real shells, but we made real shells for them. We have worked with a guy out in Costa Rica, and he knew when the hermit crabs were going to molt, and when they molt, they need to find new crabs new shells to go into. So he got some shells which had just been abandoned by small hermit crabs, and we brought them back and we did 3D scans of them, and then we 3D printed new shells with wee houses on the top. And then we put them into a box where there were hermit crabs that were ready to be looking for shells of that size. And so when they molted, they moved into the new shells with the wee houses on the front, and they walked around in them, quite happily. There was one 3-bedroom bungalow that was a wee bit top heavy, and when they got into that one, they kind of fell on its side. But apart from that, they were real hermit crabs with, just filmed as they walked round about, and took a bit longer to teach them to talk, but it was okay. So I get a chance to meet lots of interesting people. Been lucky enough to meet interesting people. I'll put that slide up, and I think you've always got to see the next one, because he's not really. It's just when you meet these people, they always get a chance to. They're always up with a step a wee bit higher. It was good meeting him, but it's an even bigger privilege meeting big mammals, because I like working on big mammals, because you're all mammals, and when you meet a polar bear, that polar bear will have a different personality from another polar bear. And if you somehow could get 30 or 40 polar bears in one place, which is kind of unusual, but supposing they were dolphins, for example. Dolphins, there'd be as many personality types in a big pod of dolphins as there are personality types here in the room. And that makes mammals just fantastic to watch with, to be in the company of. And there's something about the Arctic, it is one of the most super places anywhere. And we all know there are issues in the Arctic with climate change and things. When the sea ice begins to melt, then the polar bear basically has to swim towards shore. And I was lucky enough a few years ago to put together a sequence on a polar bear. So, just lovely animals, lovely sort of experience. So I like working with big animals, and this is another just a few seconds of something that I was lucky enough to do just last year for a geographic film, which again dealt with a big animal, but a very different big animal.
Whale sharks can grow over 10 meters long and weigh 20 tons.
They feed by forcing plankton-rich water into their huge mouths. In places, there is so much food in these seas that whale sharks can remain here all year, simply swimming from one cloud of plankton to another. It's the plankton that supports a wealth of life amongst the countless islands that lie between Asia and Australia.
Now, that was filmed in a big marine park called Raja Ampat, which is a big marine park in Indonesia. And that is a classic place where, if it wasn't for its status, it would be a much degraded place. But as it is, it has a biodiversity, the biggest range of biodiversity of coral reef, anywhere in the world. And it's really well looked after. And this particular resort and these particular whale sharks were close to a resort which deliberately keeps the numbers of divers small, charges quite a lot of money, but part of the money that you pay goes towards a bunch of wardens, so to speak, who tour around the area, and they warn fishermen who come in, because although it's a protected area, not all the fishermen know about it. And so these guys go around and they quietly give them a warning, send them on their way, and then if they come back, then they have the power to kind of semi-arrest them, but to take them and their equipment to a local village, where the local village decides on what their penalty will be, so to speak. So it's a really well looked after area, and it's great because the whale sharks are really quite accustomed to people and divers, and it's a great place to be. For the equipment side of things, this is what we're using these days, big fancy 4K cameras. You know, it's moved on a lot since I started when we were using film. But basically, it's just another way of getting fancy images. I mentioned mammals, dolphins before, or why I liked doing mammals. You know, whale sharks are good, manta rays are good, but they are fish after all, and you can't quite get the same deep relationship with a fish as you can with a marine mammal. And again, we worked in Tonga for Planet Earth in an area where Tonga is one of the few places where you can swim with whales. Now, it's a little bit, it can be controversial, but I think Tonga, they really know how to handle boats round about the whales. And we were working particularly with a guy called Lolly, who was just great. He would spend a lot of time getting close to the whale, get to know it, and then when he thought it was right, he would give me the nod and I would swim in across them. And the best bit of advice he ever gave me was, look, the first time you see a whale underwater, just keep it where you can only just see it. Don't try and go closer, just keep it where you can just see it, because just like you need to get to know the whale also needs to get to know you. And by doing that, we could, you know, work really close to them. And this was a particularly lovely female. She used to hang around this bay quite a lot, and we could go, and if she was in the bay, then she would come across, and she'd often stick her nose up like that when they approach it, because I don't know if you know, but when a whale's swimming horizontally normally, it can see down underneath it okay, but it can't see very much forward just because of the angle of its head and where its eyes are placed. So if a whale swims at you and wants to see you, it does that. It goes vertical in the water, and that is because its eyes can then look forward. And that's what the whale's doing. It's got its nose in the air because it wants to get a better look at me who's coming close. And sometimes it would just, you hang around and he would come in really nice and close. But you don't always know what's going to happen with a whale. So I've got just a little clip here, a little story about what happened when Sue, my wife at the time, we were filming humpback whale together. And well, I'll let her tell the story.
Myself and husband Doug Allan flew to Tonga to film the humpback whales. It was one of the most fabulous experiences I've had working as a wildlife filmmaker.
When you have a big 45-foot mammal looking you in the eye from just a couple of meters away, you establish this bond with them. It's really, really special.
I was filming Doug as he was filming the mum and calf, and I looked over the top of the camera and realised the calf was just a couple of feet away, and all of a sudden it turned and kind of just flipped its tail and whacked me in the leg. And it just felt like someone had hit me with a sledgehammer. I screamed and dropped the camera, which slowly started going glug, glug, glug.
Now, I was faced with this choice, save that or go for the camera.
So Doug, given the choice between rescuing his screaming wife and the camera, unfortunately there was no contest, so he swam down and got the camera as I'm saying.
No, I've been waiting for that ever since.
One of these days I might forgive Doug for rescuing the camera instead of me. Maybe.
Now, the observant among you may have noticed that I referred to Sue as my wife at the time. We still got on okay. So what was I going to talk about now? I was going to talk about, you know, food webs and kind of build. Are there any journalists, by the way, in the room? Oh, okay. Because the idea behind asking me on was to kind of try to simplify things a little bit for any journalists who are there, and you know, and move on to. I can say that because there are no journalists here. You know, kind of make it as entertaining in a way. Anyway, so pardon me if I'm you know, teaching you how to suck eggs. Anyway, isn't it intriguing how how food chains work and how food webs work and the interrelationship. And that's one of the things about MPAs, why they're so important, is because we need to leave areas as undisturbed as we can so that we can see what's happening within them. And one of the key components in the polar ecosystems is this guy, krill, who's a little shrimp. And this exists in enormous numbers, and it is the food of some of the biggest animals in the sea, i.e. the humpback whales. You know, they feed directly on krill, and sometimes it's been said that, you know, krill is the shortest, you know, krill to humpback whales is one of the shortest food chains that you can have. You obviously got phytoplankton at the bottom, eaten by the krill, or small zooplankton eaten by the krill, and then straight onto whales. You don't get it much shorter than that. And these whales are doing a thing called bubble netting, which is where you've got a swarm or a group of krill in the water, and the humpback whales will dive down, and possibly 2 or 3 of them working together will dive down, and they swim round the krill but underneath it, emitting bubbles as they go, and these bubbles come up in a curtain, and the whales make a circular curtain of bubbles around the krill, and then they get together, they actually make noises that coordinate the whales underwater, and they come up through the bubble curtain taking a scoop of krill in their mouth at the same time. But they throw the bubble curtain around it to concentrate the krill in one place. And this is you know, the Arctic food chain, or the Antarctic food chain is really dependent on krill. You know, we've got whales feeding directly on the krill, but we also have penguins feeding directly on the krill, taking it back to their chicks. And then feeding on the penguin will be the leopard seal. Leopard seals feed on krill itself, but they also feed directly on the penguins. You know, they'll take penguins. This photograph, by the way, has a title. The title of this picture is Not So Happy Feet. What else could you call it? So we found leopard seals, you know, hunting penguins, and they're pretty good. I mean, a penguin, when you think how fast a penguin can swim underwater, and these penguins catch them in open water, partly they just pursue them, but bearing in mind the visibility often isn't very good. They need to, you know, to keep their prey within sight all the time. But they do manage to catch gentoos, and they basically, it's quite interesting, they peel it almost like a banana. Imagine how you'd have to peel a banana if you had no hands. You'd have to take the banana between your teeth and kind of throw it over your shoulder. And that's really what they do to the penguins. They grab the penguin by the scruff of the neck, when the penguin's dead obviously, grab it by the scruff of the neck and sort of throw it, and they just slowly peel it out of its skin. You see this penguin's beginning slowly to get less and less attached to its skin, until eventually they just have the bits. And then they come in very gently, and they'll very delicately sort of pull the flesh off the penguins. And then following on from the penguin being eaten, there's often a lot of oil floating around on the water, and that oil will bring in the Wilson's petrels, and they'll dance around, and they'll peck the little globules of oil that are floating around on the water. So again, we've now here got a chain that's gone, you know, I've forgotten, it's gone krill to penguin to leopard seal to Wilson's petrel, indirectly all starting from there. And then when the poor old leopard seal has had enough of life and he kicks the bucket or another one, then the giant petrels will come in and they'll make the final link. They will actually scavenge. So indirectly, this giant petrel is feeding on the krill. And even bigger animals can also take the penguins as well. This guy here is the top level predator, the killer whale. I don't know if you know, well, probably do know, but the killer whale is reckoned to be the most widely distributed large mammal on the planet. You get them all the way from as far south as you can go, right to the edge of the Antarctic continent. You get them all the way right up to in amongst the pack ice of the Antarctic. However, it's not the same species. There are at least 5 species of killer whales floating around. There are 3 in the Antarctic alone. And now they may be geographically separated species. Probably if you brought them together, they could probably interbreed with each other. But they do reckon that from DNA testing and from just the way they look different, they have different sizes, different proportions, and different patterns of white on their body and things. And they certainly are speciated and feeding in different things. There are at least 3 species in the Antarctic and probably another 2 across the rest of the globe. But they're very impressive, especially when you get the chance to, as we did, to see them going into the pack ice and then taking out seals like this.
These are more docile and easier to tackle. stays close together and travels silently. This time, they unleash a far more powerful wave, and with astonishing accuracy. These big waves are not intended to break the ice, but to knock the prey into the water, and they rarely fail.
Now, we never saw a single Weddell seal escape. Once they picked it away on a floe, that was it. They just took it and took it all the time. But that actual shoot itself was a classic symbiosis between filmmaking and scientists, because we had two scientists down there who were working on killer whales. They were taking DNA samples of the killer whales that we saw, as well as doing ID photographs, and they had this really classy system where they had laser pointers on top of their cameras, exactly 10 centimeters apart. So when they took a picture of the dorsal fin, which is a classic ID shot of a killer whale, you also got the 3 laser dots on its fin, and from those laser dots you could tell how high the fin was, width of the fin. You then get the same killer whale but showing the blowhole and the fin. You can then get 3 essential parameters, which are height of fin, width of fin at the base, and distance from front of fin to the blowhole. Once you get that, you can know the overall length of the killer whale, how old it is, etc., etc. And you give these two guys basically 20 minutes with a pod of killer whales that you didn't know nothing about. And by the end of it, from the DNA and from the ID photographs, you've got who's related to who, how old they are, their sex, what they were eating, because you can get that from the blubber samples that you get with a crossbow. And it was just amazing what they did. They also put little satellite tags on them, and one of the satellite tags stayed on for 9 weeks. And what we found was that this pod of killer whales who were doing all this hunting, they would hunt in the Antarctic for a month, and then they went 2,500 miles north of Brazil, and they spent the next month off Brazil, and then they went back to the Antarctic, to the same bay, and started hunting again. And so nobody knew they made these long distance migrations, but it shows how if you're going to protect anything in the Antarctic, you also have to know where it goes for the rest of its time. And that's another reason why you want MPAs. You want long-term, long monitoring of what's there, and then link it into where it goes, all the rest of it. So you can then identify if there is something happening to that species, where is it happening? If it's not happening in the MPA, it might be happening somewhere else within its range. So it was pretty cool. It was pretty cool. And but like I say, we never saw a Weddell seal get away, and yet there were at least 4 other kinds of seals on those ice floes. There were fur seals, there were leopard seals, there were crab-eater seals, and occasionally an elephant seal. They would go up to a floe, pop their heads up, and they could recognize the difference between all those seals. And if it wasn't a Weddell seal, they just left it alone. And why did they go after Weddell seals? Probably because they're the biggest, they're the fattest, they're probably the clumsiest in the water. All the rest of them is quite interesting. The orcas did not want to get injured. They didn't want to get a scrape from a leopard seal, or deal with a very flexible, aggressive crab-eater seal. The Weddell seals were probably the easiest to catch, but also the fattest and most nutritious. So then I was going to talk about, here we are, we've got Antarctic food webs, and we've got exactly the same kind of food webs, happening off here. This one here is an aerial, a NASA shot, and we actually can see the plankton blooms that are happening round about here, and we can zero in from the NASA pictures, as you probably know, into areas that you're considering making MPAs, and you can really look at them from space. Then we can also obviously look at them underwater. And within the MPAs, again, as you all know, around about the UK, we've got all the components that we had in the Antarctic. We've got the small plankton, we've got the bigger plankton. Well, that's the bigger plankton. There's the smaller plankton, starts with the copepods. You know, the small plankton is fed upon sometimes by very big fish, sometimes by small fish like sand eels. The sand eels then get taken by puffins. They get taken by guillemots that come up there, sometimes by kittiwakes, stuff like that. You know, all these animals are interrelated with each other, and that's why MPAs and the overall modelling of MPAs, but just the hard nitty-gritty of studying who eats what and how much there is, but being able to do it in a stable environment, being able to do it somewhere where there is hopefully as little as possible outside interference. That's why it's really important, because the actual benthos, etc., as well, stuff can, not everything has to go to the top to be eaten. Obviously sand eels and things have to be within diving distance of puffins, etc. But fish like the skate, you know, they can skitter across the bottom. They obviously do a lot of benthic feeding, so they're taking crabs, brittle stars, all sorts of stuff like that off the bottom. And you've got bonny wrasse, which will be down there, ballan wrasse, and they in turn are taken by the seals and etc., etc. So the point I was going to make, again, whether, you know, to a journalist, if they needed it pointed out to them, was that we live in this big interconnected system, ecosystem, not just within, you know, an MPA, which makes its own little environment, but also, you know, the bigger picture. You know, the world's oceans are the biggest contiguous ecosystem that we've got on the planet. You know, there is far more volume of living space in the oceans than there is on land. You know, you can fly up in the air, but very few birds will fly to the depths, you know, to the average depth of the continental shelf, or the average depth of the ocean. And, you know, but when you think that, you know, animals can, you know, you can go down there into the depths, and you can go all kinds of other places. So it's really important that we know about what's happening inside those places. And that, incidentally, I wanted to make the last Blue Planet 2, I wanted Blue Planet 2 to take that as its model. I said, let's not do the coasts and the coral reefs and you know, let's not divide it up into ecosystems. Let's just follow the ocean conveyor belt round, because that'll take us around the planet. It'll take us to coral reefs, take us to all the environments that you want to cover individually, but it will link them all together, and it will link the air with the atmosphere, and you'll give people a much better overall idea of the whole ocean ecosystem, rather than, you know, rather than divide it into there's this and there's this and there's this, and link them kind of artificially. Keep this, you know, as the background to your program. Make a journey around the ocean conveyor. Make that the way to, you know what they told me? No, the public won't get that. I said, you're missing a big trick here, boys. Anyway, such is life. So just to finish, you know, we have only got one planet, haven't we? And what's his name? Gene Kranz got it dead right. You know, when they nearly lost Apollo 13, he stood up and he said, listen, gentlemen, failure is not an option. We're going to get them back. And they got them back. It took 4 days, but they got them back. And I think we need the same sort of attitude here. You know, we cannot fail, but despite all that, what's his name, Musk, you know, wants to fly us all to Mars, that ain't going to happen, not in the time frame we've got. You know, we've got one planet, and it's about time we looked after it. And the way we will look after it is by engaging with it and by connecting with it. You're at an emotional level, a scientific level, it doesn't really matter. But you engage, you connect, then you start to understand. And when you understand it, then you can protect and you can sustain it. And the basis of that really comes from science and research. You know, at the end of the day, I cannot believe the last, you know, this climate change meeting in Poland, where they're basically deciding to ignore the science. It's absolutely unbelievable how they can do something like that. But it makes it all the more important for people like you know, to stand up there and get in there and give all you can towards MPAs, because MPAs are absolutely vital in the understanding of the marine ecosystem that we have. And the marine ecosystem itself is I think, you know, it's the most important ecosystem in the world. It controls our climate. It is so much we get from it in every respect, financially, economically, you know, from a pleasure point of view. And for me, it's made my life as special as and enjoyable as mine has been. And I know that you guys feel the same too, albeit in all your different ways. And it's great to come here and to give them the chance to stand up and entertain you for half an hour. But I also want to say, as I say, thank you for having me here, thank you for listening, and all power to MarPAMM. There we are, thank you.